After my husband left for a military deployment, my brother-in-law tried to become the man of the house, claiming I was mentally unstable to stay alone, but what happened next was far worse. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story, and leave a like on the video. I should have seen the red flags from day one, but hindsight is perfect vision, right? When my husband deployed for 8 months with his unit, I thought I had everything under control. I mean, I spent 6 years in the military myself before transitioning to civilian life, so managing a household solo was nothing new. I had systems, routines, backup plans for my backup plans. I'd done this before during shorter deployments, and I'd always managed fine. Better than fine, actually. I thrived on the independence, the quiet, the ability to run things exactly how I wanted without compromise. What I didn't have was a plan for my mother-in-law's guilt trip about her recently divorced son needing a place to stay. The conversation happened 3 weeks into the deployment, on a Tuesday evening when I was finishing up some work emails. My mother-in-law called, voice thick with that particular tone mothers use when they're about to ask for something they know you won't want to give. I recognized it immediately because my own mother has the same tone when she's building up to a request. Her youngest son, let's call him the problem for now because that's what he became, had just finalized his divorce and needed somewhere to stay temporarily. The garage apartment above our detached garage sat empty. And wouldn't it be nice to have a man around the house for security while my husband was overseas? That last part got under my skin immediately. I don't need a man around for security. I have an alarm system, cameras, and a very clear understanding of how to protect myself and my property. But I didn't say that, because you don't win arguments with your mother-in-law by pointing out how her assumptions are rooted in outdated gender roles. I wanted to say no. Every instinct I'd honed during my military service was screaming at me to refuse. There was something in her voice, some undertone I couldn't quite identify but didn't like. But family dynamics are complicated, especially when you're still relatively new to a family, only married for 3 years. I was still proving myself in some ways, still trying to find my place in their established rhythms and relationships. My husband and I had video chatted about it the next day during his scheduled call time. The connection was grainy, his face pixelated, but I could see his expression clearly enough. He seemed okay with the idea, said his brother was going through a rough time with the divorce and we had the space. He pointed out that the garage apartment just sat there empty, and it would be temporary. Maybe 2 or 3 months maximum while his brother got back on his feet. When I expressed hesitation, my husband reminded me that his brother had let us stay with him for a week when we'd had that plumbing disaster the previous year. Family helps family, right? So I agreed, telling myself it was temporary. Telling myself I was being paranoid for no good reason. Telling myself that my gut reaction was just hypervigilance, not actual warning signs. I'd work on being more trusting, more flexible, more willing to accommodate family needs. That's what good wives do, what good family members do. I pushed down the feeling in my gut that said this was a mistake. The first 2 weeks were fine, actually, almost too fine. The problem moved into the garage apartment with minimal fuss, kept to himself mostly, was polite when we crossed paths. He'd knock before entering the main house, would text before coming over, brought groceries occasionally to contribute. He even fixed the loose board on the back deck without being asked, just mentioned he'd noticed it and took care of it. I started thinking maybe I'd been wrong to worry. Maybe this would be completely uneventful, and I'd feel guilty later for even hesitating. Maybe my instincts had been off this time. He worked some kind of tech job that allowed remote work, so he was around the property most days but stayed in his apartment. When we did interact, usually in passing or when he came to the main house for something, he was pleasant. Asked how I was doing, made appropriate small talk about the weather or local news, never overstayed his welcome. He seemed genuinely grateful for the place to stay. Mentioned a few times how much he appreciated us helping him out during a difficult transition. Week 3 is when the shift started. Subtle enough that I questioned whether I was imagining things. He began offering opinions on household decisions without being asked. Small things at first, things you could easily dismiss as someone trying to be helpful. I mentioned needing to call the landscaping service because the lawn was getting overgrown, and he immediately jumped in saying he'd handle the yard work instead. No need to waste money on something he could easily do. I told him I appreciated the offer, but preferred to keep the service. They'd been doing our yard for 2 years. They knew the property, and honestly, I didn't want to add yard work to anyone's obligations. He smiled and nodded like he understood, said of course, whatever I wanted. But 3 days later, I got a cancellation confirmation email from the landscaping company. When I called them confused, they said a man identifying himself as the homeowner had called to cancel the service. They'd assumed it was my husband. I found the problem in the garage apartment that evening and asked him directly if he'd canceled the service. He looked surprised, said he'd called to get a quote for comparison and must have been unclear. Didn't mean to actually cancel anything. He offered to call them back and reinstate the service. But when I said I'd handle it myself, he'd already left me a note on the kitchen counter saying he'd taken care of it. The service was scheduled to return. Except when I called the company, they had no record of that call. He'd lied about calling them back. When I confronted him about the lie, he acted confused, said he'd definitely called, maybe they'd lost the message, seemed genuinely concerned that there'd been a miscommunication, made me feel like I was being unreasonable for making a big deal out of a scheduling mix-up. That should have been my cue to shut it down immediately, to tell him clearly that this kind of interference wasn't acceptable. But I was trying to keep the peace, trying to be the accommodating daughter-in-law who didn't cause family drama over small things. The watching started around the same time, and this is where things started feeling genuinely uncomfortable. I'd be in the kitchen making dinner, music playing, focused on cooking, and I'd get that feeling you get when someone's staring at you. I'd look up, and there he'd be in the garage apartment window, just standing there, watching the house. Watching me specifically, because the kitchen window faces directly toward his apartment. It wasn't protective watching, not like someone keeping an eye out for security concerns. I know what security awareness looks like. I've done perimeter watches. I understand the difference between scanning for threats and staring at a specific person. This was different, focused, intent. When our eyes would meet, he wouldn't wave or nod or acknowledge it normally. He'd jerk back from the window too quickly like a kid caught with their hand in the cookie jar, like he knew he shouldn't be doing what he was doing but couldn't help himself. It gave me this crawling sensation under my skin. But what was I supposed to say? He's looking out his window, that's not a crime. He lives there, he's allowed to look outside. If I complained to my husband or his family, I'd sound paranoid. Oh, your brother looks out his window and sometimes I catch him? That's not exactly actionable evidence of wrongdoing. But I started locking my bedroom door at night, just in case. I started keeping notes on my phone. Date, time, what happened, what he said, how I responded. It felt excessive, maybe paranoid, but something told me I might need this information later. The real problems started manifesting in ways I hadn't anticipated, ways that were harder to dismiss as misunderstandings or helpful intentions gone wrong. I ran into my neighbor at the grocery store on a Saturday morning, someone I'd always been friendly with, and she acted weird, cold almost. We'd usually chat for a few minutes when we crossed paths, talk about the neighborhood, upcoming events, general friendly neighbor stuff. This time she gave me a tight smile and tried to keep moving past me. I stopped her, asked if everything was okay, if I'd done something to offend her. She looked uncomfortable, shifted her grocery basket from one hand to the other, and finally said she understood I was going through a difficult time and respected my need for privacy. I had absolutely no idea what she was talking about. What difficult time? What privacy? I asked her to explain, and she got this pitying look on her face that made my stomach sink. Turns out, the neighborhood book club I'd attended twice before the deployment had continued meeting every 2 weeks. But I hadn't received any invitations. Not one. I'd assumed they'd gone on hiatus or maybe disbanded. But no, they'd been meeting regularly at various houses in the neighborhood. When I asked why I hadn't been invited, my neighbor seemed surprised I didn't know. She said my brother-in-law had told everyone I was too emotionally fragile to handle social situations right now, that my husband's deployment had hit me harder than expected, and he was keeping an eye on me as family support. I felt my face get hot with anger and embarrassment. I told her clearly that I was perfectly fine, that I had no idea where he'd gotten that information, and that I'd very much like to continue attending book club if they'd have me. She looked confused now, uncertain, like she was trying to reconcile what I was saying with what she'd been told. She mentioned that the problem had been very convincing, very concerned, had even shown what he claimed was a text from my husband asking him to keep me socially engaged but not overwhelmed. That text didn't exist. I knew it didn't exist because my husband and I shared an online account where we could see each other's messages for security purposes during deployments. He hadn't texted his brother anything like that. The problem had either fabricated the text or completely made up the conversation. Either way, he'd lied to my neighbors about my mental state and my husband's concerns, effectively isolating me from my social circle while making himself look like the caring family member. I immediately texted the book club group chat, which I was apparently still part of even though I hadn't received meeting notifications. I wrote a clear message explaining that I was doing perfectly fine, that I had no idea why my brother-in-law had told people otherwise, and that I'd love to attend future meetings if they were still open to having me. The responses came in slowly, awkwardly, full of apologies and confusion. One woman, someone I'd really liked during the 2 meetings I'd attended, sent a longer private message. She explained that the problem had attended the last 3 book club meetings, representing our household since I couldn't make it. He'd been charming, thoughtful in his comments about the books, and very concerned about me. He'd described me as struggling with anxiety, having trouble sleeping, occasionally having emotional outbursts that worried him. He'd positioned himself as the steady presence, making sure I didn't spiral during a difficult time. He'd even brought wine and snacks to the meetings, made himself a welcomed addition to the group. None of it was true. I wasn't struggling, wasn't having outbursts, wasn't having any trouble managing my life. But he'd created this entire narrative, this fictional version of me that painted him as necessary and heroic, while making me seem unstable. And he'd done it in a way that seemed caring and concerned. So nobody questioned it. Why would they? He was family, he lived on the property, he seemed genuinely worried. People trust that kind of presentation. When I confronted him that evening, he was in my kitchen. Not the garage apartment, my actual kitchen in the main house, reorganizing my spice cabinet. I hadn't given him permission to be in the main house at all, and I definitely hadn't asked him to touch my organizational system. The spices had been arranged by frequency of use, the way I liked them, the way that made sense for how I cooked. He'd rearranged them alphabetically, which sounds logical, but completely disrupted my system. He looked up when I walked in, holding a bottle of cumin in one hand and paprika in the other, and smiled like nothing was wrong. Like it was completely normal for him to be in my house, in my kitchen, rearranging my belongings. He said he'd noticed the spices were out of alphabetical order and thought he'd help organize them properly. The word properly stuck with me, like his way was correct and mine had been wrong. I asked him flat out, keeping my voice level, why he'd told the neighbors I was emotionally unstable. His expression shifted immediately, became concerned and gentle in a way that made my skin crawl. It was too practiced, too smooth, like he'd rehearsed this response. He said he never used those words. He'd simply explained that I was adjusting to my husband's absence and might appreciate a gentle approach from the community. He was protecting me, he said, from being overwhelmed by social obligations when I clearly had enough on my plate managing everything alone. I pointed out that I'd been managing fine, that I didn't need protection or gentle handling, and that he'd effectively isolated me from my social circle without my knowledge or consent. He set down the spices carefully, wiped his hands on a dish towel that he'd also brought from somewhere, and stepped closer to me. Not threatening exactly, but definitely invading my personal space in a way that made me automatically step back and assess exit routes. He said I was being defensive, that he understood deployment stress could make people reactive, but he was just trying to help. He said his brother had asked him to look out for me, to make sure I wasn't struggling, and he was taking that responsibility seriously. When I told him my husband had never said anything like that, he pulled out his phone and showed me a text conversation with his brother. Except the timestamps were from before my husband deployed, before any of this started. And the texts were vague enough to be interpreted multiple ways. The gaslighting was textbook. Absolutely textbook. This wasn't just an awkward family member overstepping boundaries because he didn't understand social norms. This was someone methodically isolating me and controlling my narrative in the community. Someone who had planned this, who had built a foundation of false concern that he could point to when questioned. I told him clearly and firmly that I didn't need his help, didn't want his involvement in my household decisions, and that he needed to stay in the garage apartment unless specifically invited into the main house. He nodded slowly, said, of course. He understood. He didn't mean to overstep. But his eyes told a different story, something calculating and cold that disappeared quickly behind another expression of concern. He left through the back door, and I watched him walk back to the garage apartment with my heart pounding, knowing absolutely that this situation was worse than I'd thought. I started finding other evidence of his intrusion everywhere once I knew what to look for. My mail was opened, then carefully resealed. Bills, personal correspondence, even a letter from a friend who was also deployed. He claimed he'd accidentally grabbed my stack when getting his own from the mailbox and opened mine by mistake. Didn't look at the names carefully enough. Once, sure, that's believable. But 3 times? That's a pattern. He'd moved furniture in my living room, said he thought the flow was better this way, that the couch looked better angled toward the window. I'd had the furniture arranged specifically to avoid glare on the TV screen, but he'd prioritized aesthetics over function and done it without asking. He'd adjusted the thermostat settings, programmed his preferred temperature into the system, overriding the schedule I'd set up. When I changed it back, he changed it again, like we were in some kind of silent war over who controlled the environment. He'd reorganized my garage, moving tools and equipment to different locations that he deemed more logical. I couldn't find anything for days because everything was in the wrong place. He'd trimmed bushes in the front yard without asking, cutting them into shapes I didn't like and wouldn't have chosen. Each thing individually seemed minor, the kind of thing you could dismiss as someone trying to be helpful but missing the mark. But together they formed a pattern of someone taking ownership of my space, my life, my decisions, without permission, and without respect for my preferences. The comments about my husband started around week 5 and made everything even more uncomfortable. Little digs disguised as compliments or concern. He'd say things like I was far more organized than his brother gave me credit for, implying that my husband didn't appreciate me, that I ran the household better than most people could, certainly better than his brother would if he were home, that it was a shame I didn't get more recognition for my competence, as if my husband failed to acknowledge my contributions. Then he'd add that his brother didn't know how lucky he was, leaving a woman like me alone for 8 months. He'd emphasize the words in a way that made it clear he wasn't just talking about household management. He'd say he would never make that choice, would never leave his wife alone for that long, would prioritize staying close to someone he valued. The implication was obvious, and it made my stomach turn every time. I shut those comments down immediately, told him clearly that his brother and I had a strong marriage and my husband's deployment was part of his service commitment, not a choice to abandon me. But he'd act like I was misunderstanding innocent observations, like I was reading too much into simple statements. The thing is, I wasn't misunderstanding anything. I've dealt with enough inappropriate behavior in various contexts, both in the military and in civilian life, to know exactly what I was hearing. He was testing boundaries, seeing how I'd react, building up to something worse. One afternoon while I was at work, a woman contacted me through social media. Her profile showed she'd worked at the same company as the problem at his previous job before the divorce. She'd heard through mutual connections that he was staying with family and felt compelled to reach out with a warning. She sent me a long, detailed message that made my blood run cold. According to her, he'd told coworkers disturbing things about me. His brother's wife he'd never actually lived with before this arrangement. He claimed he was managing my finances because I couldn't handle money, said I'd made several poor decisions that he'd had to quietly fix. He said I called him crying most nights, that I was emotionally dependent on him, that the deployment had broken something fundamental in me and he was the only thing holding me together. He'd positioned himself as my primary support system, made it sound like I couldn't function without his intervention. None of it was true. I hadn't cried once since my husband left. I managed our finances perfectly well and always had. I'd never called him for emotional support, and I certainly wasn't broken or dependent. But he'd created this entire fictional narrative about me to his coworkers, painting himself as the responsible family member, nobly holding things together for his unstable sister-in-law, who couldn't manage on her own. When I asked the woman why she was telling me this, she said several coworkers had found his stories concerning and inconsistent. He'd talk about how I couldn't handle basic tasks, but then mention things I'd accomplished that clearly required competence and organization. He'd describe me as emotionally fragile, but then talk about my military background and how capable I'd been in that context. The stories didn't add up, and it had made some people uncomfortable enough that they'd started comparing notes about what he was saying. She said one coworker had finally asked him directly why his brother would deploy and leave me in such a bad state if I was really that unstable. Wouldn't there be family care plans? Wouldn't his brother have arranged better support? Wouldn't there be some kind of intervention? He'd gotten defensive. Said his brother didn't know how bad things really were, that he was protecting his brother from the truth to avoid worrying him during deployment. That answer had raised more red flags, and that's when this woman decided to reach out to me directly. I thanked her profusely and added all the information to my growing documentation. Because yes, I was documenting everything now, maintaining detailed logs with dates, times, witnesses, evidence, screenshots of every concerning message, photos of every unauthorized change to my house, written records of every inappropriate comment. If this escalated, and my gut said it absolutely would, I needed evidence that would hold up under scrutiny. The breaking point in my evidence gathering came when I found copies of my house keys in his apartment. I'd gone over there while he was at work to drop off a package that had been delivered to the main house by mistake. His door was unlocked, which should have been my first clue to just leave the package outside, but I knocked and called out and got no answer. I left the package just inside the door, and that's when I saw them. Sitting on his kitchen counter, right there in plain view, were 2 copies of my main house key. I knew they were mine because I'd put a distinctive colored cover on my original key, bright blue to distinguish it from other keys on my ring. These had the same colored covers, same key shape, clearly duplicates of my key that he'd had made without permission. Not keys to the garage apartment, keys to my main house, giving him unrestricted access to my private space whenever he wanted. My hands shook as I took photos from multiple angles. I documented their exact location, made sure the timestamps on the photos were clear. Then I left everything exactly as I'd found it, closed his door carefully, and went back to my house. My heart was pounding. The danger level had just escalated from uncomfortable to genuinely concerning. I sat at my kitchen table and started planning. This wasn't a situation where you could just react emotionally and hope things worked out. This required strategy, documentation, proof, and careful execution. Over the next few days, I installed small cameras in my house, hidden but covering key areas. Entry points, living spaces, anywhere he'd been entering without permission. The cameras were legal, installed in my own home, and set to record when they detected motion. I documented every interaction with timestamps and detailed notes. I started keeping a recorder in my pocket during any conversation with him, making sure I could prove what was said if needed later. Then I reached out to his ex-wife through social media. I'd found her profile through family connections, and I sent a carefully worded message explaining that I was her ex-husband's sister-in-law, that he was currently staying with us, and that I was experiencing concerning behavior that might benefit from her insight if she was willing to talk. I tried to be respectful of whatever trauma she might have from the marriage, made it clear she had no obligation to respond, but that any information she could share would be helpful. She responded within an hour. Her message was long, detailed, and absolutely terrifying in how closely it mirrored what I was experiencing. She said she'd been waiting for this message, had wondered when someone else would reach out about his behavior, was relieved that I'd noticed the red flags early enough to take action. She asked if we could talk on the phone, said there was too much to explain over text, and gave me her number. We talked for almost 2 hours that evening. I sat in my locked bedroom, windows covered, and listened to her describe a marriage that had started normally and gradually transformed into a nightmare of control and manipulation. When they'd been married, he'd gradually taken over every aspect of her life in ways that felt helpful at first and then became suffocating. He'd started managing her money, said he was better with finances and wanted to take that stress off her plate. Within months, she had no access to their accounts, no idea what they had or where it went, completely dependent on him for every purchase. He controlled who she saw, started declining invitations on her behalf, told friends and family she was too busy or too tired, isolated her systematically until she had no support network outside of him. He made decisions without consulting her, from major purchases to what they'd eat for dinner, and when she tried to push back, he'd make her feel unreasonable for wanting input into her own life. He'd tell her she was being difficult, that he was trying to help and she was unappreciative, that she should be grateful someone cared enough to handle everything for her. Classic control tactics wrapped in the language of care and concern. But the part that really made my skin crawl was when she described his escalation. He'd started gathering false evidence of her instability, documenting times she was upset or emotional, and framing them as mental health crises. He'd tell their friends she was having breakdowns, show them texts or emails out of context to support his narrative, position himself as the stable one holding things together. He'd threatened to have her declared mentally unfit, said he'd collected enough evidence that a court would believe him over her. She agreed to provide a written statement if needed, and warned me that he wouldn't stop escalating until someone forced him to. According to her, he believed he was entitled to control the women in his family's life, that he was smarter than everyone else and deserved to be in charge. His divorce had wounded his ego, and he'd fixate on a new target. I was convenient, available, and in his mind, abandoned by his brother and therefore his responsibility. I asked her what had finally made her leave. What had been the moment she knew she had to get out? She was quiet for a long moment, then said he'd tried to convince her she was losing her memory, that she'd agreed to things she hadn't agreed to, that her version of reality was faulty. When she'd started finding evidence that he was deliberately moving and hiding things to make her doubt herself, she'd realized he wasn't just controlling, he was dangerous. Armed with her testimony and my growing evidence file, I prepared for confrontation. What I wasn't prepared for was how it would actually happen, or how much worse things would get before they got better. I came home early from a doctor's appointment on a Tuesday afternoon, about 6 weeks into his stay. My car had been making a noise, so I'd borrowed my friend's car for the day. He didn't know I was home. I walked into my house through the side door that leads directly into the kitchen, and I heard sounds upstairs, movement in my bedroom. Every alarm bell in my head went off at once. I pulled out my phone, opened the recording app, and quietly went upstairs. My bedroom door was half open, and there he was, going through my dresser drawers. Not even attempting to hide what he was doing, just methodically searching through my personal belongings like he had every right to be there. I started recording video and asked him what the hell he was doing. He spun around, startled, and for a split second I saw real anger on his face before he smoothed it into fake concern. He said he'd been looking for something, that I'd texted him asking him to grab an item for me. I hadn't texted him anything. I held up my phone, showed him the empty message thread, and told him to get out of my room. Instead of leaving, he stepped closer. Not threatening exactly, but definitely invading my space in a way that made me tense. He said we needed to talk, that he'd been wanting to discuss something important with me for weeks now. I told him there was nothing to discuss and he needed to leave the main house immediately. He kept coming closer. That's when he said it. The thing that made everything crystal clear. He told me everything he'd been doing, all the help, all the concern, all the involvement was because he cared about me. Really cared about me. Not like a sister-in-law, but as a woman. He said his brother didn't appreciate me, didn't deserve me, had abandoned me for 8 months without a second thought. He said I should be with someone who understood my value, who would never leave me alone like this, who would take care of me properly. I was still recording. I kept my voice steady and asked him to clarify what he was saying. He actually smiled, like I was playing coy, like this was some kind of mutual flirtation I'd been too shy to acknowledge. He said I had to know how he felt, that the connection between us had been obvious from the start, that we'd been dancing around it, but it was time to stop pretending. I told him clearly, on recording, that there was no connection, that I was married to his brother and had never given him any indication of romantic interest, and that he needed to leave. His expression changed again, became frustrated. He said I was lying to myself, that my marriage was already over in everything but name, that I just hadn't accepted it yet. Then he tried to kiss me, actually lunged forward and tried to force his mouth on mine. I shoved him hard, both palms to his chest, sent him stumbling backward. I was screaming at him to get out. My heart was racing. I kept my phone recording the whole time. He steadied himself, and instead of looking ashamed or apologetic, he smiled. He told me nobody would believe me. He'd spent 6 weeks carefully building a narrative with the neighbors, with his coworkers, with our family, that I was unstable and emotionally dependent on him. He'd isolated me socially, made himself look like the responsible caretaker. If I tried to tell anyone about this, they'd assume I was having some kind of breakdown, that I'd misinterpreted his innocent concern. He'd planned this, he said, had been planning it from the moment he moved in. I kept recording. I let him talk, let him lay out his whole strategy while my phone captured every word. He threatened that if I told his brother, it would destroy the family, and everyone would blame me for causing drama. He said I should think very carefully about my next move, because he held all the cards here. Then he left, walking slowly, taking his time, making sure I understood he wasn't leaving because I'd told him to, but because he chose to. When I heard the garage apartment door close, I locked every door and window in the main house, then sat on my bedroom floor shaking, phone still in my hand with the full recording saved. I had audio of everything. His confession, his proposition, his admission of manipulation, his attempt to kiss me, his threats about the narrative he'd built. I had video of him in my bedroom. I had documentation of weeks of boundary violations. And I had his ex-wife ready to testify to an identical pattern. Now I just had to tell my husband that his brother had tried to kiss me in our bedroom and then threatened me when I rejected him. That was going to be a fun conversation. I waited until our scheduled video call time, which was about 3 hours later. I couldn't wait. Couldn't let this sit. When his face appeared on screen, he was smiling, asking about my day in that casual way we'd fallen into for these deployment calls. I interrupted him and said I needed to tell him something serious, and he needed to listen to the whole thing before reacting. His smile faded immediately. He asked if I was okay, if I was hurt. I said I wasn't hurt physically, but something had happened with his brother and I needed him to hear a recording. I played the audio from the bedroom confrontation, watching his face on the screen as he listened to his brother confess feelings, heard the attempt, heard the threats. The silence after the recording ended lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like an hour. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely flat, emotionless in a way I'd never heard from him before. He said he'd be making some calls and would get back home as soon as possible. He asked if I was safe right now, if his brother was still on the property. I said yes to safe. I'd locked everything, and yes, the problem was still in the garage apartment, but hadn't tried to contact me. My husband's jaw clenched. He said to stay inside, keep everything locked, and do not engage with his brother under any circumstances. he'd handle it. Then he said he loved me and ended the call. The whole conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes, but I could see the rage building behind his eyes with every word of that recording. What I didn't know was that my brother-in-law had been monitoring the situation, had somehow seen or heard enough to know I'd told his brother what happened. Because within an hour of that call, things escalated in a way I hadn't anticipated. My phone started getting notifications. Someone had created social media accounts using my name and photos scraped from my legitimate profiles. These fake accounts were posting bizarre, incoherent content. Rants about government conspiracies, claims about neighbors spying on me, aggressive messages to local businesses. It was clearly designed to make me look unstable, to give credibility to the narrative he'd been building. I immediately reported every profile and started documenting this new escalation. Then my boss called. She was concerned because she'd received a call from someone claiming to be my brother-in-law, reporting that I'd been having episodes, that my family was worried about my mental state, that I might need medical intervention. She was calling to check on me because the report had been detailed enough to be concerning, but vague enough to be questionable. I explained the entire situation to her, sent her the recordings, and she was immediately supportive. She said she'd document the call and that my job was secure, but suggested I might want to consider a restraining order. I thanked her and added this latest escalation to my evidence file. The problem had declared war, and he was using every tactic he could think of to destroy my credibility before I could destroy his. But he'd made one critical mistake. He'd underestimated how much evidence I'd gathered, and how seriously my husband would take this threat. My husband managed to get emergency leave, citing a family crisis that required his immediate presence. His commanding officer approved it after hearing a brief explanation of the situation. He had 48 hours to get home, and he used every minute of it traveling. He arrived at 2 in the morning on a Thursday, still in uniform, having driven straight from the airport. I heard his truck pull up and ran outside. The hug lasted a full minute, neither of us saying anything, just holding on. When we finally pulled apart, he asked me one question. Where is he? I pointed to the garage apartment. A light was on, so his brother was still awake. My husband told me to go inside the house, lock the door, and stay away from the windows. His voice had that flat, controlled quality again, the one that told me he was barely containing serious anger. I wanted to argue, wanted to be there, but I also knew when to trust someone's judgment. I went inside and watched from the upstairs window. My husband walked to the garage apartment and pounded on the door, 3 sharp bangs that echoed in the quiet neighborhood. When his brother opened the door, looking confused and then alarmed, my husband didn't say a word. He just punched him, straight shot to the face, and his brother went down. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I saw my husband grab his brother by the shirt, haul him back up, and slam him against the wall. 2 more hits, 1 to the ribs, 1 to the face again. His brother's nose was bleeding and my husband was still talking, getting right in his face and saying something that made his brother's expression shift from shock to genuine fear. Then my husband walked away, came back into the house with blood on his knuckles and breathing hard. He washed his hands at the kitchen sink while I stood there not quite knowing what to say. When he finally looked at me, he said, "Nobody touches you, nobody threatens you," and his brother was lucky he'd stopped at a few hits because his first instinct had been much worse. We sat at the kitchen table, and I showed him everything. Every piece of evidence, every documentation, every screenshot. We organized it all into a clear timeline, and then he made a phone call that woke up his mother at 3 in the morning. He told her there would be a family meeting at our house in 2 days, attendance mandatory, and she would want to hear what he had to say before asking questions. The extra day would give people time to arrange their schedules and give us time to prepare the evidence presentation properly. The next 2 days felt surreal. I'd barely slept that first night. My husband had maybe gotten 2 hours, and his brother was presumably nursing his injuries in the garage apartment. We spent the time organizing our evidence into a clear, devastating presentation. My mother-in-law arrived first, followed by 2 of my husband's other siblings and their spouses. His brother came last, sporting a black eye and swollen nose, looking sullen and defensive. My husband stood in our living room like he was giving a military briefing. He stated the facts clearly and without emotion. While he was deployed serving his country, his brother had moved into our garage apartment and subsequently attempted to isolate, manipulate, and ultimately sexually assault his wife in their own home. He said the words deliberately, making sure everyone understood the severity. Then I showed them the evidence. I'd created a presentation, organized chronologically, showing the escalation, video clips of him in my bedroom uninvited, screenshots of the fake social media accounts, documentation of the lies he'd told neighbors and coworkers. the recording of his ex-wife describing the identical pattern from their marriage. The audio from the bedroom confrontation was the final piece. I played it for everyone, and the room fell completely silent. You could hear every word. His confession, his proposition, the attempt, the threats. When it ended, nobody spoke for almost a full minute. His ex-wife had agreed to attend via video call, and she corroborated everything. She described her experience with him, the control, the manipulation, the gaslighting, and how she'd only escaped by documenting and getting legal help. She looked directly at the camera and said she'd warned him during their divorce that he needed therapy, that his need to control women would destroy his life, and he'd clearly learned nothing. My brother-in-law tried to defend himself. He stammered that I'd misunderstood, that the recording was taken out of context, that his feelings had been confused and he'd never meant to actually act on them. My husband cut him off, voice sharp, and said there was video evidence of him in our bedroom, audio evidence of him admitting to a calculated manipulation campaign, and a witness testifying to his pattern of abuse. My mother-in-law had her hand over her mouth, looking between her sons like she couldn't process what was happening. One of the other siblings said what everyone was thinking. He had to leave immediately, and there would be consequences if he ever tried to contact me again. The decision was unanimous. He would pack his belongings today and be gone by evening. My husband and his other brothers would supervise to make sure nothing was damaged or stolen. My mother-in-law was crying, but she nodded agreement. She asked her youngest son how he could do this, how he could betray family like this, and he had no answer. They packed his things in complete silence. Nobody spoke except to coordinate moving boxes. It took about 3 hours to clear out the garage apartment. When everything was loaded into his car, my husband handed him the apartment keys and said if he ever contacted me in any way, for any reason, it wouldn't be police he'd have to worry about first. His brother left without another word, and I watched his car disappear down the street with something between relief and exhaustion. The garage apartment sat empty again, and I realized I'd been holding tension in my shoulders for 6 weeks that finally released. My husband had to return to his deployment in 1 week. We spent that time reinforcing security, changing locks, installing additional cameras, and just being together. The conversations we had during those days were deeper and more honest than any we'd had before. He apologized for not taking my initial hesitation about his brother more seriously, for not recognizing the position he'd put me in by agreeing to the arrangement. I told him I didn't blame him, that nobody expects their sibling to be capable of something like this. We talked about communication, about trust, about how deployment puts stress on a marriage in unexpected ways. We made a plan for more frequent video calls, for being more transparent about struggles, for treating our marriage like the partnership it was supposed to be. Before he left, we worked together on the security system. He showed me some additional self-defense techniques. Not that I needed much refresher from my own service, but it made him feel better. We established protocols, emergency contacts, plans for various scenarios. It was clinical and practical and exactly what we both needed. I also started meeting regularly with my brother-in-law's ex-wife. She'd become an unexpected friend through this mess. Someone who understood exactly what I'd dealt with because she'd survived it herself. She taught me about recognizing psychological manipulation tactics, about trusting your instincts even when someone makes you feel crazy for having them, about the importance of documentation. We'd meet for coffee once a week, and she'd share resources on coercive control, gaslighting, and the particular dynamics of family-based abuse. She'd gotten therapy after her divorce, and she recommended her therapist to me. I started sessions, not because I thought I was damaged, but because processing what happened with a professional seemed like a healthy choice. My mother-in-law requested a one-on-one meeting about 3 weeks after my husband returned to deployment. We met at a neutral coffee shop, and she spent the first 10 minutes crying and apologizing. She said she'd failed as a mother, that she'd raised a son who thought he could force himself on a woman, that she couldn't understand where it had gone so wrong. I let her talk, let her process, but I was also watching carefully for signs that she might try to excuse his behavior or minimize what happened. For a moment, she started down that road, saying something about how he just wanted to help and maybe his feelings got confused. She stopped mid-sentence, looked at me, and said she heard herself making excuses, and she needed to stop doing that. She admitted she'd grown up with beliefs about men being natural protectors and decision-makers, in ways that probably hadn't helped her son develop healthy respect for women's autonomy. She said she was going to work on that, actively and consciously, and she hoped I could forgive her for not seeing what her son was becoming. I appreciated the apology, though forgiveness felt complicated. I told her I needed time, That trust had been broken not just by her son, but by the family dynamic that had pressured me into accepting him in the first place. She nodded, said she understood, and promised to respect whatever boundaries I needed. The video calls with my husband got better after everything happened. Deeper, more real, less surface level. We talked about fears and vulnerabilities we'd never shared before. He admitted feeling guilty for being gone, for not being there to protect me, even though intellectually he knew I'd handled things perfectly. I admitted I'd felt pressure to be the perfect military wife, never complaining about deployments, always managing everything flawlessly. We were learning to be honest in ways we hadn't been before, and the marriage felt stronger for it. Strange that it took something so terrible to force us into that kind of communication, but I wasn't going to waste the lesson. The final 2 months of the deployment passed without incident. I managed everything perfectly, proving to myself and everyone else that I'd never needed help in the first place. My brother-in-law had moved to another state, too humiliated and afraid of his brother to risk being nearby. Some family members cut contact with him completely. Others maintained minimal relationship but made it clear they didn't condone his actions. I considered filing for a restraining order but ultimately decided it wasn't necessary. He was scared enough of his brother, and the social consequences within the family were severe enough that I didn't think he'd risk contact. I kept all the evidence filed away just in case, but I wanted to move forward rather than stay locked in legal proceedings. My mother-in-law actually followed through on her promise to work on her beliefs and patterns. She started going to therapy herself, reading books about emotional abuse and family dynamics, and making conscious efforts to treat me as an autonomous adult, rather than someone who needed male family supervision. It was gradual, but I noticed the changes in how she communicated with me. The family as a whole established new patterns. More direct communication, more respect for boundaries, more acknowledgement that what had happened was serious and couldn't be brushed aside for the sake of family harmony. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. I found myself relaxing in ways I hadn't even realized I'd been tense. The constant low-level vigilance I'd maintained throughout those 6 weeks was finally gone. I could be in my own house without listening for footsteps from the garage apartment, without tracking another person's movements, without wondering what boundary would be violated next. When my husband's deployment finally ended and he came home for good, the reunion felt different than I'd imagined it would 8 months earlier. We'd been through something that had tested us in unexpected ways, had forced us to confront weaknesses in our communication and family dynamics, and we'd come through it stronger. He walked through the door on a Tuesday morning, and I met him with a hug that felt like relief and homecoming and 1,000 other emotions I couldn't name. He looked around the house, taking in how perfectly I'd maintained everything, and said he was proud of me. Not in a patronizing way, but in genuine recognition of what I'd handled alone. We spent the first few days just being together, relearning each other's rhythms, talking through everything that had happened in more detail now that we had the luxury of time and presence. He showed me the letters he'd written but never sent during the deployment, processing his anger and guilt and fear about what his brother had done. I showed him the journal I'd kept, documenting not just the evidence, but my emotional journey through it all. The fear, the doubt, the strength I'd found, the relief when it was over. We shared these pieces of ourselves that we'd carried separately, and it felt like building something new on a foundation that had been tested and proven solid. About 2 weeks after he got back, my mother-in-law organized a family dinner to welcome him home officially. Everyone was invited except his youngest brother, that absence making a clear statement about consequences. During the dinner, my mother-in-law did something I didn't expect. She stood up, asked for everyone's attention, and made a public acknowledgement. She said she'd failed as a mother and as a mother-in-law by not listening when I'd expressed concerns, by pressuring me into a situation I hadn't wanted, and by raising a son who thought he could force himself on a woman. She said she was grateful her other son had a wife strong enough to protect herself, and she was committed to making sure nothing like this ever happened in their family again. The room was silent, but it was the kind of silence that felt like collective recognition rather than awkwardness. My husband reached over and took my hand, and I felt the support of everyone present in that moment. It didn't erase what had happened, but it validated that it had been real, that it had been serious, and that the family took it seriously. My brother-in-law tried to call once, about a month after my husband returned. My husband answered, and the conversation lasted maybe 5 seconds. He said his brother's name, listened to whatever was being said, then spoke clearly and firmly. "Don't call again, don't come back, we're done," and hung up. When I asked what his brother wanted, my husband said he'd been trying to apologize, asking for another chance to explain himself, but it was far too late for apologies to matter. We never heard from him again. The family maintained the boundary collectively, nobody offering him a way back in, nobody making excuses for him, nobody suggesting enough time had passed that we should forgive and forget. It was the consequence he'd earned, and everyone seemed to understand that some violations don't get second chances. The months after everything settled were about rebuilding, not just the house security or family dynamics, but our sense of normalcy. I managed to get all the fake social media profiles removed within a few weeks by providing evidence to the platforms, and they acted quickly once they saw the documentation. We went back to regular routines, made plans for the future, talked about eventually starting a family ourselves once we felt ready. My husband transitioned to a non-deploying position, partly because of what happened and partly because it was time in his career trajectory anyway. I kept meeting with my brother-in-law's ex-wife, and we developed a genuine friendship beyond trauma bonding. She was funny, smart, building a new life for herself, and we supported each other through the ongoing process of healing from family abuse. She started dating someone new, someone who respected her boundaries and treated her like an equal, and I was happy seeing her happiness. My therapy sessions became less about processing trauma and more about general life management and relationship strengthening. The therapist helped me understand that what I'd experienced was coercive control, a form of abuse that leaves invisible scars, and that my response had been textbook correct. Document, reach out, protect yourself, involve authorities when necessary, don't engage alone. I'd done everything right, and hearing that validation from a professional helped. My mother-in-law and I developed a better relationship than we'd had before everything happened, ironically. She respected my boundaries completely now, asked before assuming, treated me like an adult with full agency, and we could actually have honest conversations about difficult topics. The crisis had forced honesty that might never have happened otherwise. Looking back on those 8 months, I can see clearly how it unfolded. The slow boundary violations, the isolation tactics, the gaslighting, the escalation to actual assault attempt. I can see how he'd planned it, how he'd built his narrative carefully, how he'd underestimated both my military training and my unwillingness to be controlled. What he didn't count on was documentation, evidence, support systems, and a family that ultimately chose to believe the victim and hold the perpetrator accountable. He didn't count on his ex-wife being willing to testify to his pattern. He didn't count on me having cameras and recordings. He especially didn't count on his brother's reaction when he learned someone had tried to assault his wife. I learned things about myself through this experience. I learned I could trust my instincts even when someone was telling me I was crazy. I learned I was stronger than I'd known, more capable of strategic thinking under pressure, more willing to fight for my safety and dignity. I also learned that marriage requires constant work, constant communication, constant willingness to be vulnerable and honest. The deployment had been hard, but the crisis with his brother had forced us to communicate in ways we'd avoided before. We were better partners now, more honest, more trusting, more willing to share the difficult stuff instead of just presenting our best selves to each other. My brother-in-law's life, from what little we heard through extended family, spiraled further downward. His actions had consequences beyond just being kicked out of our garage apartment. Word got around at his workplace about the false reports he'd made and the social media manipulation. When coworkers started comparing notes about his contradictory stories about me, HR got involved and he ended up losing his job. Friends and extended family cut ties when they learned the truth. His reputation in the community was destroyed. He'd tried to ruin my life to cover his crimes, and instead he'd ruined his own. I don't take pleasure in that exactly, but I don't mourn it either. Actions have consequences, and he'd made his choices knowing they were wrong. The fact that he'd done the same thing to his ex-wife showed it wasn't a moment of confusion or poor judgment. It was a pattern of abusive behavior. He needed serious intervention, therapy, probably medication, and he'd refused all of it. Some days I think about how close things came to being much worse. If I hadn't come home early that day, if I hadn't been recording, if he'd been more patient in his escalation, if I'd been less trained in recognizing danger. The alternate timeline where he succeeded in his manipulation, where I'd ended up doubting my own reality, where the family believed his narrative instead of mine, haunts me occasionally. But that's not what happened. What happened is I caught him, documented everything, protected myself, reached out for help, and a family ultimately chose to support the victim over protecting the abuser. What happened is my husband came home, addressed the threat, and we rebuilt our marriage stronger than before. What happened is the bad guy lost and faced consequences. Sometimes the good guys win, and sometimes justice actually happens, and sometimes families actually hold abusers accountable. This was one of those times, And I'm grateful for it even as I recognize how easily it could have gone differently. Now, more than a year later, life is normal in the best possible way. We have routines, plans, hopes for the future. We have a marriage built on honest communication and mutual respect. We have family boundaries that are healthy and maintained. We have security systems and safety plans that make me feel protected. We have the knowledge that when crisis hit, we handled it together effectively. The garage apartment is rented to a nice couple with a baby who needed affordable housing. They respect boundaries, pay rent on time, and wave when we cross paths. It's everything the previous situation wasn't, and the contrast makes me appreciate it even more. I've started mentoring other military spouses, sharing my experiences, helping them identify red flags, encouraging them to trust their instincts and document concerning behavior. Several have reached out saying my story helped them recognize similar patterns in their own lives and take action before things escalated. That feels like purpose emerging from trauma. My husband and I talk sometimes about whether we'd have made different choices if we could go back. Would we have said no to his brother moving in from the start? Probably yes. Would we have maintained better communication during the deployment, even without the crisis forcing it? We hope so, but honestly, we might not have. Sometimes it takes something terrible to shake you into necessary changes. This is where we are now. Stronger, wiser, more careful about who we trust and why. More willing to believe women when they report abuse. More aware of how isolation and coercive control work. More committed to honest communication and setting boundaries without guilt. More grateful for the normal days that string together into a peaceful life. My brother-in-law tried to make me a victim, tried to isolate and control and ultimately assault me in my own home. But I refused to be that story. I documented, fought back, reached out, and survived. And now I'm living proof that you can face down a threat, protect yourself effectively, and come out the other side not just okay, but genuinely better than before. That's the real ending. Not dramatic or explosive, just honest and real. Life goes on, stronger and more intentional than it was before. The garage apartment that was supposed to provide security instead brought threat. But we neutralized that threat and reclaimed our space and our peace. And that's worth everything. And that's worth everything.